Hi, everybody. Let's talk about war for a moment in a more principled sense. Wars are not caused by madness, sudden hatred, or inexplicable evil. They are prepared, often decades in advance, by intellectual failure, moral blindness, and the loss of judgment. The devastation we've been witnessing across Ukraine and Europe is not the result of bad policy or tragic miscalculation alone. It is the consequence of ignorance and immorality joining hands in political decision making. In this video, I want to address the deepest layer of the Ukraine war, not events, not battles, but the failure of thinking that made this war possible. Because, make no mistake, without restoring intellectual and moral clarity, no negotiation, no matter how well intentioned, can ever lead to peace. Welcome back to my Philosophy and Strategy series. This is the first video in a trilogy on the Ukraine Russia war dedicated to answering the question of how to bring about peace in a meaningful and lasting way. This first part sets the stage and stands under the title War and the Problem of Intellectual Illiteracy. Modern societies like to believe that war is caused by villains, by irrationality, or an outbreak of sudden madness. This belief is comforting, but it's false. War does not emerge in a vacuum. It emerges from chains of reasoning, from narratives about responsibility, causality, and legitimacy. When those narratives are false, policy becomes destructive. We are therefore not merely facing a geopolitical crisis in Ukraine, we are facing a crisis of intellectual illiteracy in matters of war, strategy, and political responsibility. This illiteracy does not excuse violence, but it explains why violence became thinkable and eventually inevitable. To understand this failure, it helps to recall a basic philosophical insight. In Twilight of the Idols, Friedrich Nietzsche described what he called the four great errors of human reasoning. The first and perhaps the most dangerous and certainly utterly irrelevant here is the confusion of a cause and effect. Human beings tend to treat outcomes as if they were origins. People moralize consequences while ignoring the conditions that produced them. This error exists not only in abstract thinking, in the reality of human and political relations, it has oftentimes devastating political consequences. If we apply this error of thinking to Ukraine, we have to say that the dominant Western narrative claims that the war in Ukraine began with Russian aggression, an aggression out of imperial ambition, power lust, or nostalgia for the Soviet past. But this narrative commits precisely the error Nietzsche described. It treats military action as the cause of the conflict rather than its effect, its result, its outcome. Once this inversion of cause and effect is accepted, moral judgment collapses into propaganda. Responsibility is assigned without inquiry, and diplomacy becomes betrayal. War becomes inevitable. This should certainly not be the way how serious political judgment should work and how political decisions should be arrived at. Confusing cause and effect does not merely distort analysis, it destroys reasoning and removes the human factor from the equation. If consequences are treated as causes, then responsibility is assigned blindly. One side is demonized, the other is absolved. Moral language becomes a weapon rather than a guide. Politics, stripped of ethical reflection, degenerates into pure utility. Power replaces judgment, and human dignity becomes merely collateral damage. This is precisely what I warned against in my earlier video, From Kant to Crisis, explaining that when politics loses its transcendental grounding, its sense of duty, dignity, and the guidance of moral law, it loses all restraint. And this is what happened at the level of the EU, and it is the reason that caused Europe's devastating failure of judgment. Because Europe did not stumble into this war by accident. Long before the first shots were fired, judgment was abandoned. Strategic literacy gave way to moral, or rather moralizing, meaning bare of any morality, reasoning, and posturing. Philosophical seriousness was replaced by ideological conformity. Complex security dilemmas were reduced to slogans. Warnings were dismissed as excuses, and moral self confidence replaced responsibility. Once this intellectual collapse occurred, war became not only possible, but likely. Let me be clear that this is not an exercise in retrospective blame. It is simply a normative clarification. Any peace process that begins from a false causal narrative will inevitably reproduce conflict simply because peace requires recognition, legitimacy, and restraint. Peace in Ukraine and a future European security architecture should not be built on mythology and reasonably false assumptions. Without restoring clarity about cause and effect, negotiations will certainly continue, agreements will be signed, and yet the next war will already at the same time be prepared. In the next video, I will apply this philosophical diagnosis directly to the concrete strategic events of the Ukraine war. We will examine the case of Crimea 2014 and, above all, the outbreak of the war in February 2022 and the claim of unprovoked aggression. We will look at all this not emotionally, but strategically from the vantage point of political philosophy and epistemology. Because let's be clear, without intellectual honesty, there can be no true and honest responsibility. And with acknowledging responsibility, there can be no peace. I'm Dr. Edwin Mitsevsky, and this is At Stake. I'll see you soon for the second part. Take care.